My screen.
And then just take it away.
Okay, thank you for including me in this. I'm thrilled to do this. My name is Eddie Tafoya. I'm a professor in the English department. And I tweaked the name of my presentation today to The Gospel of Empowerment, Lessons from the Judeo-Christian Bible for Heretics, Blasphemers, and Apostates like me. And that's supposed to be funny. Okay, I want to start with a thought experiment. Let's say you woke up tomorrow morning, turned on CNN, and you saw this headline: Burial Remains of Adam Found. The upshot being that an anthropologist, an archaeologist, has discovered irrevocable proof that that first person mentioned in the Bible, Adam, actually walked and talked and lived in that valley where the Tigris meets the Euphrates. Would we find Adam or would we lose him? I'm going to say we would lose him. And the reason for this is because right now Adam is a myth. And myths are much larger than facts. If we reduce the story of Adam to a bunch of facts, then we lose much of the magic, much of the beauty of the story. Let me explain. The Bible begins, the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, begins with this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was a formless void. There was darkness over the deep, and God's Spirit hovered over the water. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. Now, if you read the two creation accounts in the book of Genesis, you see that there are a lot of contradictions. But we can piece together a pretty good process of what's going on. First, God gives us that divine pronouncement, "Let there be light," and there is light. And then he separates the water from the dry land. And then he creates Adam. And he brings all the objects and animals of Adam, of the Garden of Eden to Adam, and has him name them. So if he brings Adam a rock, Adam says that's a rock, that thing is called a rock from then on. God brings him a puppy, Adam says that's a puppy, and that thing is called a puppy from then on. And eventually, God creates Eve, and one day Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, and they're in the middle of the Garden of Eden, and they taste the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and they get cast out of the Garden of Eden. Now, I'm going to say, if this is a myth, it is a beautiful story. It is a universal story. In fact, it is the most universal of stories. And I don't care what religion you practice, or if you practice a religion or not, it is your story. It is my story. It is the story that is analogous to the birth process, birth and maturation process. Now, we all come from a paradise, the womb, a place where there is no gap between desire and satisfaction. And once we are born, the first shock we experience is usually light. Hence that divine pronouncement, "Let there be light." The second shock we experience is the difference between wetness and dryness. God separated the water from the dry land. And then as we mature, we begin to use words. And the main function of words, at least at such an early age, especially nouns, is to distinguish me from that which is me from that which is not me. I am me, that's the couch. I am me, that's the stove. I am me, that's my mother. We use words to distinguish the I from the not I. And all of this has a nice, neat analogy in those first two creation accounts in the book of Genesis. If we jump ahead in the book of Genesis, a few chapters, we come to the story of Abraham and Isaac, which is a very troubling story. It always troubled me. And the story is this: God and Abraham enter into a contract. "I will be your God if you will be my people." I know that line comes from the book of Jeremiah, but basically the same dynamic is happening with Abraham and Isaac, or with God and Abraham. And God promises Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abraham doesn't understand this because his wife Sarah is barren. Well, lo and behold, one day, Sarah does get pregnant and eventually brings forth Isaac. When Isaac is a young man, God calls upon Abraham to take Isaac to the top of Mount Moriah, put him on an altar, and offer him as a human sacrifice. Abraham takes Isaac to the top of Mount Moriah, binds his hands, puts him on an altar, and as he's getting ready to plunge the knife into the boy's body, an angel appears and stops Abraham's hand. Now, this is a very troubling story. What kind of God would demand this? Scholars for millennia really have said the centerpiece of this story is Abraham's faith, Abraham's devotion to God. I'm going to say something different. I'm going to say the centerpiece of this story is this angel right here. Now, what is an angel? If you look at the Greek term from where we get the word angel, angelos, it means messenger. So an angel may very well be a winged seraph being like we see here, but could also be just somebody who brings you a message. The suggestion here is that an angel could also be just a flash of insight, an epiphany. I'm going to say this is a story of evolution, the evolution of human consciousness. Humans evolving to the point where we finally begin to say, human sacrifice is futile, it's brutal, it's cruel, it serves absolutely no purpose. We won't do it anymore. Let's jump ahead to the New Testament, to the story of the feeding of the 5,000, the only miracle that appears in all four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's particularly interesting in the Gospel of John because of this little boy here in the lower part of the picture. He doesn't appear in the other three versions. And the story is this. Jesus is preaching to the multitudes, 5,000 people, not counting women and children. Do with that information what you will. And it turns out the apostles realize they don't have enough food to feed the 5,000. So the little boy steps forward and says, I will offer what I have, 5 barley loaves and 3 fishes. Jesus blesses the loaves and fishes, and the food magically multiplies. So much so that by the time all is said and done, the apostles collect 12 baskets of leftovers. Now, I'm going to say this is a miracle, a real miracle, but not in the conventional sense. What is a miracle? Usually we think of a miracle as a violation of a law of nature. Jesus walks on water, that's a miracle. Jesus turns water into wine, that's a miracle. But the word miracle really means a wondrous work of God. It doesn't have anything, the original word doesn't mean a violation of a law of nature. It just means a wondrous work of God. So that epiphany that Abraham experiences could very well be a miracle. I'm going to say the miracle that happens in the feeding of the 5,000 is this. This boy, the symbol of innocence and generosity, steps forward and says, I am willing to share my food. And the people around him say, well, if he can share his food, I can stop hiding my food and I can share my food. And everybody starts sharing their food and they realize they have enough. If we look at this as a mere fact, as a mere collection of facts, it's something that only happens once, and that's when the holiest person in history is walking the earth. If we look at it as a parable for what's going on, or insight into the human condition, it's a miracle that replicates anytime somebody empowers somebody else, somebody shares his resources with somebody else. Anytime somebody feeds each other, feeds somebody else, actually feeds them with food, or feeds them politically, spiritually, culturally, what have you. It's a miracle that goes on and on and on and on and on. Which brings us to the parable of the mustard seed. Now, Jesus tells us in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. And he says the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, and yet when planted grows into a plant so big, birds can nestle in its branches. Actually, he's wrong, at least on one count. Mustard is not the smallest of all seeds. Poppy seeds are smaller, orchid seeds are smaller, duckweed seeds are smaller, that's wolfia. And Jesus would have known this. But mustard has a very special quality. Mustard is basically the goat's heads or toritos of first century Palestine. That is that if a patch of mustard plants goes unchecked, the plants are so hardy and germinate so quickly that it could easily take over a field and render it useless for anything else. So if we provide some historical context, we can see what Jesus is talking about here. If we look at the social hierarchy of first century Palestine, we see at the very top of the Roman imperial aristocracy, and there are very few of them. At the very bottom are the abject poor, the absolutely poor, and there are a great many of them. And between them are mostly poor people. There's the relatively poor and those of minimum existence. And the fact of the matter is that if you live in first century Palestine, chances are 90% that you will be poor. You'll be on one of these three lower tiers. Add to this that the Holy Land, beginning about 63 BC under Pompey, had been taken over by the Romans, a pagan oppressive force, and the Romans had basically made Hebrews second-class citizens. So much so that if you're a Hebrew walking down the road late to an appointment and a Roman is coming the other way, doesn't have to be a Roman centurion, doesn't have to be a Roman official, doesn't have to be a Roman aristocrat, your garden variety, working class Roman is coming the other way, carrying a bag, he can compel you legally to carry that bag in the opposite direction you're going 1 mile. So Rome has its collective foot on the collective neck of the Hebrews. So back to that mustard seed. If you're a Roman official hearing Jesus talk about mustard seeds and mustard plants, what you are hearing more than likely is this Hebrew hick talking about farming. And you're probably thinking those Hebrews, all they can talk about is farming. No wonder the Egyptians kept them in bondage for so long. If you are a Hebrew, you're hearing a story about a bunch of small things working, germinating and spreading so quickly it takes over the land. You are hearing the story of revolution. Every Hebrew living in first century Palestine would understand this metaphor. So let's go to the most dramatic story in the New Testament, other than the resurrection of Jesus, and that's the story of that's the story of Lazarus and his resurrection. And the story is this. Jesus is going to Bethany, which is this town outside of Jerusalem. And he's going to visit 3 of his friends, Mary, her sister Martha, and their brother Lazarus. When he gets there, he finds out that Lazarus has died. He sits down, he cries, he gets back up, walks over to the tomb where Lazarus's corpse has been lying for 4 days, and he calls Lazarus out of the tomb. And lo and behold, Lazarus comes out of the tomb. Great story, very dramatic. But let's think about this. What do we know about Lazarus? We know that there is somebody named Lazarus mentioned one other time in the gospel in the New Testament, and that's in Luke 16. And that's the story of Lazarus and the rich man. And the story is this. Lazarus is begging outside the rich man's door for the crumbs that falls from the rich man's table. The rich man refuses to help him. They both die. Lazarus goes to a place called Abraham's bosom, which seems to be an analogy for heaven. The rich man goes to Hades, which is the Greek version of hell. The rich man begs Lazarus to help him. Lazarus says he cannot do it. This is basically Karl Marx's dream in which the poor overtake the rich. I don't know if it's the same Lazarus. I don't think anybody can speculate. Anybody knows if it's the same Lazarus. I guess we can all speculate. That's mentioned in John's gospel. But nevertheless, we know he lives in Bethany with Mary and Martha, and that Mary had a jar of spikenard, which is a very expensive oil, which she used to anoint Jesus' feet. So there might have been some wealth. We don't know. We know that he dies and stays in the tomb for 4 days before Jesus resurrects him. And although he later dines with Jesus, after his corpse has been reconstituted, he never says anything about his death experience. He never tells us what's on the other side. And then, perhaps most interesting, Roman and church officials use the resurrection of Lazarus as the reason to arrest, try, and crucify Jesus. This is different from the Synoptic Gospels, from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the reason Jesus is crucified is because he cleared the temple. And if you think about it, this makes sense. It kind of makes sense, because Herod's temple in first century Judea is the cultural, political, economic, social center of the community of Jerusalem. So when Jesus attacks that temple, he is attacking his society at its very core. He is committing an act of treason. Which leads to the question, why is resurrecting Lazarus such a violation? Why does it warrant one of the most brutal executions ever devised in human history? Well, if we look at this in context of what's going on there, well, we can pretty much guess that Lazarus had a very good chance of being very poor or being poor. We know that he has to carry that Roman's bag 1 mile if compelled to do so. We know that he belongs to a community or a society or a culture that is being oppressed by Romans. We know the Romans are in bed with certain church officials like the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin, the church council. And we see that Lazarus is under layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of oppression. So he is socially, probably economically, culturally, and religiously a non-entity. He is virtually dead. Even if he is vertical, even if his heart pumps blood, even if he still breathes, he is virtually dead. So Jesus walks up to him and gives him his life back. He says, Lazarus, from now on, the church officials don't rule over Lazarus. The merchant class doesn't rule over Lazarus. The Sanhedrin doesn't rule over Lazarus. The Romans don't rule over Lazarus. Lazarus rules over Lazarus. This would be no less miraculous than raising a corpse. This would be no less seditious than clearing the temple. And that is because if Lazarus, this poor person, this poor Jew, is reclaiming his life, that means every poor person, 90% of the population in first century Palestine, can reclaim their lives. This is the beginning of a revolution. So here's my takeaway. If I empower my neighbor, if I share food with my neighbor, if I share cultural, economic, spiritual, social food of any kind with my neighbor, the 5,000 are fed. But when people band together to work together to take back what is rightfully theirs, the faith the size of a mustard seed has moved a mountain. And anytime anybody takes back charge of their life, anytime a dope fiend stops using, anytime an alcoholic stops drinking, anytime an abuser stops abusing, anytime a business owner has a business that fails and he gets up, wipes himself off and starts all over again, Lazarus has been raised from the dead. Thank you. Any questions?
If you have any questions, feel free to unmute, or you can put it in the chat, raise your hand, whichever you like.
Okay.
I'd like to take this time to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
It is my pleasure.
There is one comment in the chat for Marthan. Very interesting. Do you have other examples you can share?
Yes, I have tons of examples I can share. Can you be more specific?
I'll just unmute, that's easier. What is your source material? Do you have references? More that you can share beyond this talk?
Sure, I do. Let me show you. This, I don't think, let me share my screen and I'll tell you. You see my PowerPoint?
Yes, I see Guide to the Bible, Saul Levin.
Saul Levin, he was one of my advisors at Binghamton. He just died last March at age 101. And I'm convinced he knew the Bible so well because he was one of the original editors. He's just a brilliant man, and he has this old Jewish Colonel Sanders looking guy. And I drew a lot on his work for this presentation and for my New Testament class. And then this is a really interesting book called Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism by John Shelby Spong. He's an Episcopalian bishop who just died about a month ago. And then this is a book by John Dominic Crossan. He's the one who discusses the importance of the raising of Lazarus. He's a former Jesuit priest and Christologist. He studies the life of Christ, one of the most famous and well-revered Christologists on the planet. A professor emeritus from DePaul University, and his book is his most influential book, most famous book is Jesus: A Revolutionary Biography. And then I used material from this book, The New Testament: A Student's Introduction by Stephen Harris. This is actually the textbook for my New Testament class. So those are my sources. Anybody else?
There is another comment in the chat from Kevin. He said, thank you, Dr. Tafoya. Reminds me of some of the great classes I had at Loyola University in New Orleans.
Oh, lucky you, going to Loyola. Well, maybe I'm not as much as of a heretic as I thought I was. I don't know if that's good or bad.